So our first speaker, who I'd like to welcome up, is Catharine Ward Thompson, who's Professor of Landscape Architecture and Director of the Open Space Research Centre at the University of Edinburgh. And Catharine is going to be talking about what makes a city work for older people.
Thank you very much, Julia. And I'm reminded of, when you speak of that great work, putting health into place, of work we're doing up in Scotland, where I come from, with NHS Health Scotland and Architecture and Design Scotland, producing a place standard, which is a Scottish attempt to put health into place and to look at the importance of place, physical environment in relation to health. So I'm interested in what makes a city work for older people, and as a landscape architect, I'm interested essentially in anything open to the sky. So outdoors, very built, quite green environments, urban, natural, built, whatever. And the context in which I've been working increasingly is the UN Sustainable Development Goals that I know you've all memorized by heart. But interestingly, these goals are also considered by the World Health Organization to be the best basis for generating better public health. So sustainable environments are about healthy environments, and WHO sees their role as to work with these sustainable development goals. So good health and well-being, number 3, of course WHO would be interested in that, but they're also interested in life on land and sustainable cities and communities. And just one example of a goal under sustainable cities and communities, 11.7, by 2030 provide universal access to safe, inclusive and accessible green and public spaces, in particular for women and children, older persons and persons with disabilities. So right there is a linking goal that is about putting health into sustainable cities and communities. In the world of looking at links between environment and health, where I've been doing research for some time now, we're very much interested in how people at the heart of all of this are influenced by different kinds of environments at different scales. And this is one version of a model that many of you may have seen before, but you can look up if you haven't, taking a socio-ecological approach to health and well-being. And of course, we used to think naively that that wider outer circle, climate stability, global ecosystem, was one we couldn't actively intervene in. We needed to work in the natural or built environment and activities there. We now realize tragically we can influence and are all of those domains, from the smallest and most personal to the widest and the global. But for many of us working in the built environment, it's those middle blue rainbows, as it were, natural environment, built environment and activities that our designs can most directly influence and where a lot of our work is focused. Another contextual thing is thinking about why, if we're trying to make a difference to public health, we should care about places like this. This is Edinburgh, a walkway, a cycleway along the meadows. And there are increasing publications from the public health sector that talk about the importance of returning to an idea we had in the 19th century, that changing the physical environment is not just nice to have to help health, it's essential if we're going to have better public health. And so these two quotes just underline the fact that people in public health are seeing, if we don't pay attention to the physical environment, we will end up with greater costs in the health sector. We have to pay attention to physical environment too, for the longer term best health of the population. If you want to look at a lot more research than any of our speakers can cover in one session, I've recently contributed to a publication that WHO European Region produced, and this is freely available and downloadable online, on urban green spaces and health. And that summarizes a lot of the recent research on links between urban green spaces and health. So do have a look at that if you want to find more on the evidence. And then a later publication also looked at urban green space interventions in health. So if you want to get some idea of what people have been trying to do in the physical environment to make a difference to health, where the strengths and weaknesses and challenges are, what the demands for evidence are, then that's very helpful. Drawing on my own research in Open Space Research Centre in Edinburgh, but working with colleagues across the UK, some of our early work demonstrated things that won't be surprising to any of you. Whatever age we are, including when we're age 65 and over, living in an environment that makes it easy and enjoyable to get outdoors, surprise, surprise, is associated with being more physically active, healthier, and more satisfied with life. And the longer we can keep doing that as older people, the better for our well-being, mental and physical. And then the kind of numbers we produced in some of our research, the sort of things that politicians particularly like. Can you pin it down to something a bit more crunchy, Catherine? So, do you live within 10 minutes walk of a local open space? Some of our early research showed in a population aged 65 and over that people who had a local open space within 10 minutes walk of where they lived were twice as likely to achieve recommended levels of healthy walking, 2.5 hours per week, than people who lived further away. And they were also more than twice as likely to be satisfied with life compared with those whose local open space was further away. So local open space that is attractive, a public park or something similar, can be a very important part of a healthy lifestyle as we move into our 60s, 70s, 80s, and many of us 90s. Does where we live make a difference in other ways? What about getting to a public open space that we might enjoy being in? We need to have good paths on the way. Again, that predicted people being twice as likely to achieve recommended healthy levels of walking in our sample. And something that I'm increasingly concerned about, as many of us may in our very old age end up in some kind of sheltered accommodation or care home, people living in these conditions were 3 times less likely to go outdoors for 5 hours or more per week. Now, some people will be physically unable to get outdoors even with the assistance of carers, but many of us into very old age actually could get outdoors, and we might be so much better for it if we could. So something to think about in designing and in managing and staffing care home and sheltered home facilities. I haven't got time to give you all the details of some of the research I'm giving you a flavour of in this talk, but this is work where we tried to look at trade-offs between different attributes. We know in an ideal world all the things we would love to have in an environment that would make it attractive, make it easy for older people to get outdoors and have an enjoyable time when they are outdoors. The real physical environment isn't like that. We can't necessarily have all the ideal conditions when we've got a pre-existing built environment. So we were trying to look at trade-offs. What are the things that are more important or less important in our participants? And this gives you some sense of that. So a lack of nuisance, evidence of vandalism, that kind of thing, dog mess, a lot of people talk about that to us. Facilities are important, access to toilets, very important. Trees and plants, very important too. A lack of heavy traffic on roads can put people off. Things that engage us, things to watch, and the quality of maintenance were the top 6. In all of these, I have references. If you can't catch them now, I can make make them available to you afterwards. All of these are important: seats, pavement quality, but some, comparatively speaking, were more important than others. And these models in our research allowed us to look at some trade-off scenarios. So, for example, we know people like trees, even into old age. They want to go into an environment where they can see trees, enjoy the birds singing in the trees. But if there was a trade-off between having heavy traffic but lots of trees, or fewer trees and lighter traffic on the way to the park, they'd rather have the light traffic. So heavy traffic, busy roads with vehicular traffic is a real turn-off. Trees versus facilities. We know facilities, particularly access to toilets, are very important, but actually people were willing to trade that for having tree-lined paths and lots of trees and plants in their open space. And we know that people like well-maintained open spaces, but they were even willing to trade that for having something that was aesthetically pleasing, something attractive, because engaging with the natural environment, hearing the birds sing, seeing the flowers bloom in spring was so important to people's enjoyment and well-being. We did a study looking at environmental interventions, a Sustrans project, which was a pilot project working mostly with deprived urban communities in residential streets, looking at reducing the speed and volume of traffic on their street, not quite a home zone, but the same kind of idea, but with less radical interventions, and seeing how people felt about that before and after. Very few things where we found a significant difference before and after in people's attitude to their environment and how they used it. The change in the intervention was significant in making people believe that it's easy to walk on my street. So something changed that made people feel more positive about that. Interestingly, we saw also a significant difference in people's attitudes to how whether neighbourhood streets and paths were safe to walk in after dark. Now, as far as we know, no one changed the lighting on any of these streets in an intervention. So this is a message about safety and issues of after dark. Lighting for sure can play a role, but it's not the only or the simple answer to any issues to do with safety. We think this response, this significant response after the intervention, was probably due to community engagement that happened during the intervention, where people got to know their neighbours a bit better, got to feel that their neighbourhood was cared for a bit better, and that made them more confident going out. We don't know for sure, but an interesting result. There was a difference of opinion about how much cars, private cars, were allowed in the street and how close they were allowed to park near people's homes. Some people liked the fact that there were fewer cars, but for other people, not being able to park outside their house was a real disincentive. So we need to think about this as we want to try and reduce our streets of unnecessary vehicular traffic. At the same time, understanding that for older people, knowing that you have access to a car may make you feel more independent and more likely to go out. Just getting outdoors at all and be able to feel confident of going anywhere may be the key to maintaining a healthy outdoor activity in daily life. Over a 3-year period that we studied, actually the changes, the DIY streets changes on the residential street didn't seem to have as much of an impact on well-being and other outcomes that we looked at, like social engagement or quality of life, as the wider environment at a neighbourhood level. And one of these factors, which we weren't surprised at, related to open space such as parks and safe and enjoyable routes to those public parks and open spaces, both paths and cycleways. So that wider neighbourhood, having access to the local park and having easy and enjoyable ways to get there, seemed to be still strong predictors of quality of life. We also looked at individual idiosyncratic projects that took people out of doors. So we asked them what kind of projects they did and how well the outdoors made it easy and enjoyable to do those projects. So we're now recognising we're all different, we're all individuals, we want to do different things, different desires, different opportunities present themselves to us that make us want to go outdoors. And having more personal projects associated with outdoor activities predicted a better quality of life, especially if those environments where people went supported contact with nature. So we do think that getting outdoors is good, but also contact with nature is good, even as we move into old age. Having more projects that were utilitarian, as opposed to the other categories we looked at, social projects, recreational projects, or contact with nature, was associated, interestingly, with a lower quality of life. And again, we have to surmise a bit to interpret this, but we think that might have been partly due to projects that were utilitarian, that people had to do, that took them outside the house, but which were not enjoyable. Can you still hear me? Sorry, I feel that the volume is going funny. So if you've got an environment that doesn't support you and you still have to go out to get to the doctor or the shops or whatever it is, then that may actually impair your quality of life. And the final set of projects I'm going to talk about very briefly are the most recent project that I've been involved in with older people called Mobility, Mood and Place, and we have a special website that looks at our findings from this. It's a very big and multidisciplinary project. I should say, although I'm a landscape architect, I'm very lucky to work with people from many different disciplines, from gerontology to psychology. A lot of very clever people that are not me have contributed to this research. One aspect of this has been using mobile neuro headsets. So we're measuring on the move people's neural activity, their brain activity, as they move about the real physical environment. New physical technology allows us to do this for the first time, and as far as we know, no one else has done this with a population aged 65 and older. One of our participants was in their 90s. And we've been looking at what changes we see in neural activity as people move, for example, from a busy urban environment into a public park or green space within and around the area that they live. And I haven't got time to give you all the details, although some of this has been published and is being published at the moment. But some of our research shows changes in the amount of attentiveness that people apparently need to pay to their environment to cope with it when you go from a busy urban environment to a public park. And we think this reflects something that in theory is called attention restoration theory. We know that busy urban environments and other kinds of activities that involve focused attention can exhaust us. Sitting watching your computer can exhaust you, but also dealing with a busy road and crossing the street and navigating the pavement and other people in the street. And that can become increasingly demanding on our attention as we age and maybe find that our cognitive capacities are a bit impaired. So that can make us less resilient to coping with going outdoors in our local neighbourhood. But if we can go into a green space, we see that demand on attention, on directed attention, is lowered. We have an experience which has been described as soft fascination, where natural environments tend to engage us, but we don't have to make an effort. If you think about the pleasure of looking at wind in the leaves, hearing birds sing, the changing patterns of light on a water body or on a lawn, these are the kind of things that we can enjoy looking at, soft fascination, but we don't have to make an effort, and that can be very good for restoring attention. So it suggests we need a lot of this natural environment intermittently in our urban spaces, in our urban structures, to allow us to cope with the busyness of really busy places. Just a few last other findings that we've come across. We did a lot of work. We don't always just wire people up. We always believe in talking to and, more importantly, listening to our participants. So we did a lot of work, including some work in London, co-design work between our master's students and older people from local environments. And among other things, we produced an A to Z of co-design that drew on our experience of working with older participants to understand their desires and their hopes for their local residential environment. This is available online, so you're very welcome to download that. It has lots of references too if you're interested. 4 things that came out of that we really highlight. Access for all. People want inclusive access, and that includes opportunities for alternative ways of accessing. It's not always about the ramp. It might be about a good set of stairs with a good solid handrail too. Access to nature, access to light. People really wanted access to good quality daylight, and we know that can make a difference as we age, to our circadian rhythms, to how well we sleep, to our vitamin D, strengthen our bones. We need to worry about those if we're women. All of these things are important. And of course, access to others. As we age, many of us, particularly we women, may end up living on our own, and we know that being socially isolated is an independent health risk factor. So we need to be able to have access to social engagement when and how we want it. We need to be able to look out, to engage if we choose to, but also to choose not to engage if it doesn't look quite right for us. And this visual example is just one student design that was attempting a contemporary version of a building outdoor environment interface that might facilitate that. And finally, we were looking at environments across the life course. This is working with health geographers, very innovative work, where we worked with a cohort of people who are now in their 80s, who've been studied for the last 10 or more years as they've aged, but whom they lived in the Edinburgh and Lothian region area, but whom we know also lived in Scotland in their childhood. Intriguingly, we have there some IQ tests that were done with these people age 11, and we've tracked them now in older age. We can give them those same tests in older age and see how they've changed between age 11 and age 70 or 76 or 81. So very powerful cohort, working with a lot of psychologists, but I'll just sum up some key findings from them. We found in looking at the rate of cognitive decline once you got over 70, no change linking access to green space either in childhood or adulthood and cognitive decline before 70, but after 70, we found childhood was a particularly sensitive period. You had a slower rate of cognitive decline if you had good access, closer access to public parks near where you lived, age 11, and this was enhanced by green space access, good public park access in adulthood. And we found the pattern strongest amongst women and those in lower socioeconomic groups, for whom the local environment gives greater press. We also looked at mental health in older age and anxiety and depression as outcomes. And again, we found a significant green space influence over the life course. In this case, only limited to people living in the most socially disadvantaged neighbourhoods. But we know in general that if we're wealthy, if we're well off, we're more likely to have good health than if we're socioeconomically deprived. And so it's really important if we can make a difference through the environment to the health and quality of life of people who are socioeconomically deprived. Access to green space public parks during childhood makes a difference to anxiety and depression in older age. And for anxiety, every decade of life spent near more green space made a difference to these outcomes in older age. So we're just publishing some of this. It's very innovative. As far as we know, no one's done this before across the whole life course. And it really underlines the importance at all ages of access to good quality, green and natural environments if we want to age healthily, as we all indeed hope to do. And we have a lot of evidence from some of our lovely older participants that many people aged 80 and into their 90s can expect to live in the community, can expect to maintain quality of life, can expect to enjoy outdoor activities if they have good environmental support, if the environmental supports what they want to do and can make it be an enjoyable experience. But we do have to ask, what about the people who didn't have a good childhood experience of green or natural space? How well are they going to cope in older age?